Ravenheart, Chapter 1, by K.A. Thomas. Otto went walking in the woods every day. His life was routine, marked by a rhythm that even drums could not mimic. Sunrise was a quick breakfast in the town square where all the old widows took their meals. Then it was off to help his friend Jasper tend to his garden. After his lunch, he worked on the furniture he made for the town's wealthy inhabitants. In the best part of the day, after the evening meal, when the sun was just about to scuttle off behind the horizon, he walked in the woods. It was not a social life, but it was an ordinary one for an old dwarf like himself. In his younger years, he had been quite a popular fellow, the most handsome and charming dwarf in the town. He married the town beauty, and he loved her with a fire that would make a blacksmith blush. Everything seemed perfect until the following year, when she prepared to give birth to their first child. Being male, he was not allowed into the small birthing room of their home. His wife was attended by several birthing mistresses who assured Otto that all would be well. But soon the birthing mistresses sent for more aid, and after just a few hours had summoned the herb mistress, the most skilled of the dwarf healing tradition. Long hours passed before Otto finally heard the soft cry of a baby. But his joy was not to last. No sooner had they put the baby in his arms than the birthing mistresses informed him of his wife's condition. Otto had barely enough time to say goodbye before his darling closed her eyes and journeyed into the great abyss of the unknown. It was only a week later that the little child Otto loved so dearly followed his mother in death. He had been tiny and suffered greatly from a congestion the herb mistress could not understand. Otto sobbed, too heartbroken to assist, as he watched his friends place the carefully bundled child into the cold ground. It was many months before the dwarf emerged from his house to once again sell his furniture at the market. By tradition and law, dwarves marry only once. So at a very young age, Otto joined the ranks of the widows and widowers, who took their meals together and distanced themselves from the rest of the township. They provided each other with comfort and friendship in hopes of forgetting what they all had lost. However, Otto missed the constant companionship of a wife. It was not in any dwarf's nature to be shy or withdrawn, and he longed for company, some constant chatter as he worked to keep himself from thinking about his wife and child. In an effort to assuage his loneliness, he adopted a small kitten, which he named Jack. He and Jack were instant friends, and Otto enjoyed caring for the small animal. But the old dwarf still felt a longing in his heart for something more. It was then that he endeavored not to think of what he had lost. Otto buried himself in his little cat and his work and his long evening walks. He sorted out the days passing with diligence and planned for what the next day might bring, keeping his mind filled with thoughts of work and his simple life. On this chilly fall day, he thought of the chairs he had left to make and how he might carve a table from one solid oak trunk. Otto thought of his friend, the weaver, who he could ask to make him a warm coat for the approaching winter. Maybe he could also trade a few solid wood chairs to one of the farmers to pay his portion of the cost to feed the widowers. As he was thinking, he watched a cold wind scatter leaves across the forest floor. It seemed to carry them gracefully, like fairies dancing in the air. But the breeze also carried something else, a queer, soft sound. Otto quieted his thoughts and listened carefully as the cry came again. Memories from many years before were suddenly dancing in his head. Even though he was a father only briefly, he knew the sound of a child in distress. Otto calmed himself and told his uneasy thoughts that it might be a bleating kid who had lost its mother nanny goat, or maybe a calf crying in the evening air. But when he heard it for the third time, his heart quickened. This could be nothing other than a child. He followed the cries to the edge of a stream, and there he saw a baby wrapped carefully against the cold in warm fleece blankets and nestled in the long grass under a tree. It looked as if the child had been placed there with care, as if a mother and father might reappear at any moment. When the child saw Otto, its soft crying stopped, and it looked at him with wonder. The child could not have been more than a few months old and was clearly human from her shape. The border of the human kingdom was only a 3-day ride by pony down the steep mountainside, and so it was reasonable that a child could get lost in the woods. However, here was a child too young to walk, and humans never came this close to the dwarf villages. The peoples preferred to keep to themselves for their own reasons. Otto looked at the child, and the child looked at Otto. For long moments he stood there contemplating what to do. "Hello?" he called in a low voice to the trees. "Is anyone around?" It was a silly question, but somehow Otto needed to ask it. Did he honestly expect the child's parents to suddenly appear from behind a tree? No one was inside, and if someone had been anywhere around, Otto would have heard the break of a branch or the sound of footsteps on pine needles. It was not an easy thing to hide in the forest. Carefully, he approached the bundle and held out his hand, feeling of the soft wrappings. He let out a cry and stepped back as he felt the fierce tug of a tiny hand, only a little smaller than his own, take hold of his beard and give it a swift yank. The child laughed at his outburst, a long, gleeful baby laugh, and its fat lips smiled at him. "You're a strong one, aren't you?" He smiled, sensing a dimly familiar emotion gripping his chest. He had felt this way when he held his own sick child in his arms. He sighed. There was nothing to do now but take the human baby home, for he certainly couldn't leave it to a cold fall night. Heaving the bundle into his arms, he made his way carefully back to the village. The baby cooed and laughed the entire way. Otto was unsure of exactly what to do with the child, so he brought it to the village square, where he knew many of the other widows and widowers gathered after the evening meal to talk and make merry before nightfall. When he approached them carrying the baby, he was immediately greeted by a fanfare of widows, young and old. They bombarded him with questions and marveled over the child in his arms. "A baby? A human baby? Where did you find it? How can this be? Is it a boy or a girl so large?" So Otto sat down on one of their benches and, holding the child protectively in his arms, he told of how he had found it hidden in the grass beside the stream. "The stream's too low even in this time of year to carry such a burden. Someone must have placed her there," one of the women said after he finished his tale. "How do you know it's a girl?" one of the men asked. The woman only chuckled. It was Gerda, and she had given birth to 10 children. Her husband had died only the previous year, and had he not, no one doubted that she would be giving birth to her 11th child. Check under the wrappings, if you will, but that's a girl's laugh if I ever heard one. "Let me hold her, Otto, you poor man, heaving her all this way." Otto handed the child to Gerda, but moved to sit next to them, keeping a protective eye on his forest find. Had the child been a dwarf and smaller, he would not have given her up at all. The group talked amongst themselves for almost an hour before deciding they should call the town chief to the square for his wise judgment on the matter. Someone went to fetch him, and the others stood around gawking at the baby. "What should we call her?" Gerda asked. "It's not right for a child to go without a name, even if we only keep her for a few days." "For a few days?" Otto felt a stab as he said it. "Certainly. Surely her parents will be found, or some sign of how she was lost." She cuddled the child closer. "Poor dear." The others murmured softly around them as Otto looked into the child's eyes. She was looking back at him much as she had when he first saw her in the forest. Her eyes were the color of the richest forest leaves. They burned like emeralds in the deepest cavern of the earth. "Ayla," he said, "because I found her under an oak tree. And her eyes, they're the color of spring leaves." Ayla meant oak tree in the old dwarf tongue. Gerda shook her head. "You men and your professions. Have to give them a name for what you work. Can't be Bonnie or Liana. Has to be named for an old tree." Otto smiled, remembering that Gerda's husband had been an iron worker and all of her children had the names of the metals he labored over. Long ago, Otto had named his own weak son Paif for a tree that grew along the riverbank and was just as weak and sad to look at as that small babe. Gerda was right. When the town chief Justra arrived at the square, he had already been told what the messenger knew about Otto's encounter, but he asked that the widower relay it again. He listened with a keen and interested ear. "Gerda and I had just decided to call her Ayla when you arrived," Otto finished, waiting for the chief's reply. Chief Justra's brows furrowed with an air of concern. "This human child could mean much trouble for us, Otto. What if her parents only lost her in the woods, and we have humans coming into the village to search for her? Or even worse, what if a human comes here looking for her and accuses us of taking her by force?" The crowd murmured. The thought of humans coming into their town was not a pleasant one. They did not even deal with the creatures in matters of trade, and few dwarfs had even seen one up close. They knew of them from books and drawings, but little else was known. It was rumored that they were mistrusting and warlike, eager to fight any battle that they thought they could win. "But what shall we do with her?" Otto asked, eagerly awaiting the chief's judgment. In a dwarf town, a chief's pronouncement was as good as a human lord or king's. Dwarfs existed in towns and villages, but not as a nation. It was for each community to decide how it wished to act. Only occasionally did the chiefs of every town and village gather to decide matters of trade. Chief Justra nodded, satisfied with his decision. "We will send a message into the human kingdom with the next market trader that passes along the forest road. We will say what we have found and ask that someone comes to claim her." "And if no one comes?" Otto asked. "Then," said Justra, "we will take her to the nearest human village and leave her with someone who knows how to care for her rightly." Another murmur passed through the gathering of dwarves, and Otto stood up. "Sir, if no one comes to claim the child, I would like to keep her for a companion in my old age." There arose a startled cry from the crowd around him. Otto continued, raising his voice above the crowd. "As you know, my own wife and child died many years ago, and I have been alone all this time. It would be comforting to have someone to care for and to look after." Chief Justra shook his head. "Otto, we don't know the first thing about caring for a human child." He hesitated and then added, "I know you're alone, Otto, but a human child is not a cat. It can't be all that different from a dwarf child, and I learned much about that in the week before I lost my son." He faltered a bit, his voice cracking. "Sir, I found this babe in the woods, and I feel I should care for her." There was silence as all awaited the chief's response. He looked from the widower in front of him, old, fingering his hat and graying beard, to the child in Gerda's arms. After a moment, he let out a tired sigh. "If no one claims her, you may care for her." Otto smiled broadly. "Thank you, sir. Thank you." Chief Justra held up a halting hand. "But I fully expect her to be claimed, and if someone comes into this town looking for her, I expect no fuss in giving her up." Otto nodded. "No fuss. None at all." Chief Justra left them, and the group of old and young widows and widowers gathered around the child again, cooing and talking in high tones to the little girl who was already almost half the size of Otto.